Well, I think on the issue of the environment in particular, there is a major departure with the current administration in Washington. I don't think that's in any way controversial. The people who have been put in charge of the regulatory agencies, particularly the Interior, Secretary of the Interior and the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Administration, are dedicated to dismantling those very institutions which have been created to protect the soil, to protect the air, to protect water. Just recently, the Arctic has been opened up to offshore drilling. Major coastal areas of the U.S. have been opened up for coastal drilling. 2 million acres of precious and pristine and sacred to indigenous population in Utah have now been opened up for exploration by these resource-hungry corporate capitalist institutions. You know, there's one thing that capitalism has always wanted and has always strived for, and that is everything. They want to make as much money as possible in the shortest time period as possible. That's in their DNA. I mean, we can talk about, you know, the system and where it has its weak points, and it does have weak points. But institutionally speaking, structurally speaking, they are driven by this, as Marx said, this werewolf hunger for profits. Profits über alles. I think, particularly in the area of the environment, that there's been a real rollback under the current regime in Washington. And I use that word, you know, as I would use it for other totalitarian regimes to some extent. It does feel like a regime. It doesn't feel like a government or an administration. And we hear over and over again from climate scientists, from people who know about these issues, terms such as historic, unprecedented, record-breaking, tipping point, turning point. They've almost lost their meaning. They've almost lost their impact to make people feel the urgency of the crisis because it has become so routine. So the war on nature has greatly accelerated in the past 1 year. And if the tar sands, if that pipeline goes through to BC, it will be one more dagger in the heart of our mother, one more dagger in the heart of Pachamama, of Matrabumi, of Tierra Madre. And we have to defend the earth. That's, I think, something that is, you know, absolutely crucial right now. And the planet is getting hotter and hotter. There are more and more what are called extreme weather events in the U.S. Cyclones, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods of greater frequency, and not just greater frequency, but of greater intensity and length. So recent storms that hit the U.S. are testimony to that. In this past summer alone, we've seen temperatures of 54 degrees in Kuwait, 52 degrees in Baghdad, 51, 52, 53 degrees in Pakistan. The earth is heating up, it is on fire, and to release fossil fuels into the atmosphere is so incredibly destructive that words completely fail me. I'll just quote James Hansen, who is the climate scientist in the US who first alerted the Congress that there was something seriously amiss with the climate and that human activity could be contributing to the heating of the Earth's atmosphere. James Hansen. Okay, he's resigned now from NASA. He was a NASA scientist so that he could speak out on these issues without, you know, incurring any retribution. He said if these tar sands, which are the filthiest oil on Earth, the filthiest source of carbon, if they're released, it will be a time bomb for the planet. So these robber barons, these capitalist captains of industry who may grace the covers of your business magazines and be treated with respect and veneration on US news programs like National Public Radio or on PBS or any of the other major media are in fact killers of the earth. And we should call them out on that whenever possible. Now, one of the big problems we've had on the left and with organizing is we want people to be the people we're targeting, the people we're trying to reach. We want them to be somewhere where they're often not. You know, they haven't, schooled themselves in Gramsci. They haven't studied Engels or Marx. They haven't engaged themselves perhaps politically. So to approach these people who we want to embrace and win over, I think, in order to create a larger platform for social justice and saving the planet. I think, what you just talked about, that's what is at stake. And if you have children or grandchildren, or even if you don't, I think it's, an absolutely urgent issue that we all must get involved in. And to get involved, we need allies. We need to get out of our cocoon and out of our bubbles and not say, not be dismissive of people, who may have supported, the great leader that you now have in Ottawa, the Indian fashion wardrobe king and queen, using his own children as kind of props for photo ops. I mean, that's pretty amazing. You talk about cultural appropriation. There's a perfect example of that, what Edward Said would call Orientalism, See the nice little, brown people running around in their quaint native costumes, So going to where people are is critical, but also not eliminating, people we may not agree with. Oh, you eat meat? Gosh, I can't talk to you, you're not a vegan? You're just a vegetarian? Can't talk to you. You voted for Trudeau? What? How stupid can you be? You supported Hillary Clinton? What? These are all kind of rhetorical fusillades, that come cascading out of the mouths of very self-righteous people. And we may feel good about doing it, wow, we're so cool. But it doesn't welcome people into the circle. It really puts people off. So going where people are, not where we want them to be, is a very important strategic calculation, Float like a butterfly but sting like a bee. Yes, as Muhammad Ali said. But also extend that hand and not be so imperious about simply dismissing people because they're not of our persuasion. And I think in the area of the environment in particular, and we see this over and over again in the US, when you drop these labels of left, liberal, right, conservative, and you ask parents, for example, do you want your children to eat nutritious, healthy food? Or, you have a choice, do you want them to eat additive-laden GMO products with colored, loaded with colored dyes so your salmon looks extra red, etc. on these, in these farms? Or do you want, healthy food? Overwhelmingly, as soon as you get out of that framework of left liberal and or conservative right, every single parent says, I want my kid to have healthy food. Every single parent says, I want to drink clean water, not contaminated by, effluents from, the mining projects, which in this country and around the world are absolutely staggering. I mean, I think I learned fairly recently that 75% of the major international mining corporations are headquartered in Canada. I mean, that's just a staggering figure for a country of 35 million. And around, so water, food, do you want your kid to be able to recreate in healthy environments? Do you want parks and well-maintained trails? This is not a left or liberal, right issue in the States. Everyone says, yes, we want that. And then when you talk about other issues like affordable health care, affordable housing, which is a huge issue as well. I think you go through that right here in Vancouver. People say, yes, we don't want 80% of our income going to paying some rentier class that may or may not even live in the province. I saw an interview recently with a woman who works at McDonald's, single parent. She has 3 kids. She earns $1,200 a month, sometimes working 2 shifts, and she pays $900 for her rent. I mean, and so she was asked, well, you know, how do you manage? Oh, well, I give kids less food. I don't buy them clothes. They don't get the school materials that they need because, you know, we don't have the extra money. So on these issues, I think, like Gramsci says, there are always cracks in the monolith. They may not be readily apparent, but we can find them. And Leonard Cohen talks about that light in the spaces, you know, that we need to penetrate and open up and to create an alternative, a progressive alternative that's based in justice, you know. And as Daniel Webster, maybe he didn't say it or said it, the great work of humankind on earth is the struggle for justice.
Why don't we, I'm mindful that some of you have some questions, and I'm mindful also that David has some books, and he's available to sign them. I'm also mindful that there's a Tina Fontaine rally that's been happening while we've been here. There's been a march through the city from CBC over to the courthouse. That was from 2 to 4 was the march. And just speaking to the brothers here, next Saturday is a gathering called How I Will Change. And it's a conference around men's accountability around violence against women. And it'll be talking about some of these issues we've talked about today, and this intersection of violence against the earth as violence against women, and also an ability for us men to step up and not be allies but be accomplices. And I think we're talking a lot about that today, is instead of being allies or bystanders, but actually active participants shoulder to shoulder in seeing these changes. So Saturday it's called How I Will Change, and the website is .ca, howiwillchange.ca. I invite all the brothers in the room to come to that. So I'm carrying this mic so I can come up to see you, and if we have time we'll see how we go. A couple of questions.
This is mostly directed to David Barsamian. You mentioned briefly the barrel that produces all the rotten apples, and I was hoping you were going to enlarge on that. Maybe you could now.
Well, the barrel is capitalism.
Okay.
And to give you a perfect example is the case of Bernie Madoff, this Wall Street wheeler dealer who stole money from orphans and grandparents and looted accounts of very vulnerable people. And so there was a lot of virtuous rage directed at him. That he's so awful, so terrible. Let's put him away for the rest of his life, etc. And there was a trial, and he was convicted, and is now serving time in jail. And there have been other instances like that of Rajaratnam, the Sri Lankan hedge fund trader in New York, who also looted funds and lied and was convicted. So the system has a way of semi-cleansing itself by holding up these demonstration kinds of what they would say, this is justice in action. We are keeping our house clean, when in fact the barrel keeps producing over and over again these rotten apples. And until that barrel is changed, and yes, I'm arguing for some kind of collective action, because I think the important point is solidarity. It's about reinstilling the ethic of an injury to one is an injury to all, which Margaret Thatcher virulently attacked and denounced and said, there is no society. You're all individuals. You're not connected. You better look out for yourself. There is no alternative. Tina, that was Thatcher, who was so greatly admired by Ronald Reagan and other right-wingers in the U.S.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo. I'm from Latin America. I have a question for David. And I think that all the panelists were also addressing this issue about democracy. I would like to know why we are still defending democracy. Because from my perspective, sometimes I feel that democracy is a basic Western project. It's based on a class system. Initially, in Athens, it was based on male owners. They weren't, so slaves and female, they were not able to vote. But we still, and that was the indirect democracy, but we are still like defending the project of democracy. So if, for instance, if you go back to my country and ask indigenous people if they want democracy, they don't want democracy, they want their land back and their resources back. That's my first question. And my second one is about capitalism itself, that we are always like addressing capitalism as predatory capitalism. I think that capitalism is itself predatory. It's about appropriation and about private ownership. From this perspective, I feel also that sometimes as activists, we are also having these kind of contradictions, because at the same time we are promoting a book that is published by Metropolitan Books. That's a division from Macmillan Books, and that's a division from Holzgreen. That's a media corporate. So at the same time, Noam Chomsky maybe is working for the media industry in an indirect way. So they are making money as rentiers. So maybe I would like to ask, or maybe you can ask Noam Chomsky if he would like to send me his book through PDF. I got my email. Very nice. And that's a way also in order to go forward against capitalism, as you're saying, that is one of the main problems. So those two things, mainly democracy as a Western project and capitalism itself. Thank you.
And what country are you from?
From Chile.
From Chile.
The neoliberal project.
A country rich in U.S. interference and intervention, where a democratically elected government was overthrown in a coup d'etat run by the CIA in 1973, and also a country that has been heavily exploited by resource extraction corporations, particularly from North America, but from other parts of the world as well. And I always quote Pablo Neruda when I talk about imperialism, because some of the best poems about imperialism are written by Neruda, like La United Fruit Company and the Los Dictadores and Reciben Órdenes contra Chile. Some great, great poems. So if you want some spiritual nourishment, read Neruda, Canto General in particular, in the heights of Machu Picchu. About democracy, well, maybe it's overrated. You know, maybe this is this version that is currently being promoted is in fact quite corrupt. We had a Supreme Court justice in the United States years ago, actually, who said you can have either great concentrations of wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And what we find in the US today, maybe unlike Canada, is the enormous influence of big money. People like the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and Stephen Wynn and Rebecca and Robert Mercer, they have big hedge funds in New York. They wield an enormous amount of political power. They flood the candidates, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, with money. They want to have influence over legislation. So whoever wins is betrothed to them. And that speaks to the whole corruption of the US system, where we don't have publicly funded elections. They're almost entirely driven by private funds. And who pays the piper gets to, name the tune. And that's why, US democracy is so enfeebled now. It's fatigued. By the way, its inequality is in its founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That inequality is built in there. And also the racism, with indigenous people called savage beasts and described as being close to wolves. One of the charges against King George in the Declaration of Independence is that he unleashed the savagery of these beasts against the population, exactly reversing what was going on, because it was the white colonial settlers that were carrying out mass murder of the indigenous population. So maybe it's time for the fire this time. Maybe we need a different way of thinking about organizing our political systems. And it may take a long time, poco a poco, si scala la scala. Step by step, little by little, things change, but then you never know when something radical is going to happen. Let me just give you 2 quick examples. Rosa Parks and Mohamed Bouazizi. Okay, Rosa Parks, I suspect you all know who she is. She refused to sit down on the back of the bus on December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, launched the civil rights movement, extolled today as a great act of heroism. She would never describe it in those terms herself. She was a deeply politically driven, ideologically organized woman who had studied nonviolence and civil disobedience at the Highlander Center in eastern Tennessee. This wasn't just, the way that she's presented in the States. Tired woman, tough day at the office, feet tired, wanting to see. What rubbish, because that's the idea of an African-American woman being ideological and politically motivated was very threatening. So, she was draped in those kinds of dismissive clothes. And what she did on that day was not the first time they tried the sit down on the bus. It was the 3rd or 4th attempt. The previous ones had not succeeded. This one took off. The Montgomery bus boycott began. An itinerant preacher from Atlanta, 26 years old, just moved to Montgomery from Atlanta. Martin Luther King Jr. was his name, and he became the voice of the civil rights movement. And de facto, de jure apartheid in the United States started to unravel. I'm sorry to report that segregation has now been reconstructed, particularly in the school systems, where I've heard reports that there's more segregation today in U.S. school, dividing African American and Latino students from their white counterparts than ever before. I can't corroborate that, but it sounds plausible. Now, take the case of Mohamed Bouazizi. Why is he significant? Well, the Arab Spring, a series of revolutions, was started by a vegetable seller who was being shook down by a government official demanding bribes. Okay, you want to sell your vegetables and fruits here? Pay me off. He refused. He went to the town council. No one would talk to him. He went to the governor of the province of that in Tunisia. No one would talk to him. And he decided to kill himself to bring attention to this injustice. And then that ignited a series of uprisings. Within 3 weeks, this entrenched dictator of Tunisia, Mohammed Ben Ali, was overthrown. No one could have predicted that. And subsequently, Mubarak and other dictators fell. Now, what has ensued, of course, is not to be emulated. But it is possible for change to happen and happen. And we don't know how it occurs. But what we do is we keep lighting these palitos, these little kindling sticks in southwestern Spanish, and hope that one of them bursts into a larger flame. And that's how change happens. Cannot always be predicted.
I just wanted to put a little historical observation for you. There is a PDF available online, and it's called The Oldest Participatory Democracy on Earth, and it's referencing the Haudenosaunee. So the authors are Johansson and Grindy. You might want to look at that, because we know Franklin and Jefferson were looking at the Haudenosaunee and attending condolence feasts to see the model of groups of nations together in a confederacy. So you might enjoy that instead of just looking to Greece. You may already know that.
So let's do 1, 2, 3 quickly as possible.
I have a question actually to anybody in the panel. Is that one of the things is, after the Second World War, what we had throughout the world, particularly in the industrial nations, was an array of safety net programs that were created, including universal health care, and it moved the populations. We also had a women's movement, going back to wherever you want to start, the suffragettes or whatever, and that also was a major catalyst in moving society forward in a progressive fashion. What are your comments in terms of let's say nowadays we've just now got the Me Too movement, which has obviously had positive implications, but there seems to be a kind of a stalling in the women's movement when we need it more than ever. And so what are your thoughts about, you know, how that can be reactivated? Because obviously women haven't achieved pay equity, they haven't achieved a whole bunch of other things. So if anybody wants to comment on that.
In terms of solidarity, do we need this? Certainly not an expert on this, but I do think, I mean, it's like David's talking about tipping points. You don't know whether something is going to tip something off. I mean, Me Too has its limitations. It does seem to be a sea change, though, but I think you also are seeing, I know from my own experience working in activism, you're seeing people do cross over into other fights. So, you know, the fight for pensions, the fight for reproductive rights, obviously that's a women's issue, but, you know, there are a lot of women involved in a lot of these other fights. It's hard for me to say that that's necessarily, you know, that's the women's movement, but it's operating through other challenges and other initiatives. So I would never, I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is you remember the gay students who supported the miners during the miners' strike during Thatcher? I mean, we see when they supported each other, and the miners were not happy at first, but then showed up at the gay parade. You know, I think there are a lot of I think there's a lot of crossover. So I don't think you're necessarily seeing feminism operating as its own identity politics solely alone, but also in other fields. It's just whether that's happening or not, I don't know, but I'm hoping, I see it, and I'm hoping that we start looking at it that way.
Very quickly, and then last question.
Yeah, first of all, I have to thank the four of you for not just speaking to our minds, but to our hearts. Like, you guys are really fantastic speakers, and it's really inspiring, and lo and behold, you're standing on the shoulders of Chomsky, so no surprise there. I'm going to preface my question with the disclaimer that I'm not coming from a devil's advocate point of view, but perhaps you can provide some insight, any of you. The capitalism of Henry Ford and the post-World War II, post-Bretton Woods system is much different than the capitalism today. And many on the left and on the right argue that today we actually don't have capitalism, true capitalism. And I've heard this from the most fringe right-wing school of economics, Chicago School of Thought people saying that this isn't actually capitalism. This is like, coerced monopolies. And I'm really curious to know whether you think we can chip away some reforms to have some fairness with the current system that we have, because American capitalism, the way I see it, is different than the way Canadian capitalism operates, and it's largely because it's been co-opted less. So.
We'll take Marie's question first.
I'd like to get back to the issue of democracy. I think it's a really important one. And it's easy to see how you're disillusioned. But number one, if you look at the bigger picture, democracy's worked in a lot of areas of the world for many, hundreds of years. The Scandinavian countries, even in Kerala, I think they had a degree of democracy. I hope they still do. New Zealand, which I lived in, was really, it's regaining its. But in so many of these countries, they have a socialist background, and they were communal thinkers before democracy started, and nobody interfered with them having democracy. Like every time a small country, Bolivia, Haiti, Honduras, anyway, wants to have, and they want democracy. Believe me, I just made a film about how much people want democracy in Haiti. They're not allowed to have democracy. Not real democracy. They're allowed to have an arranged democracy of people that we impose. So you have to take all that into consideration. Because especially like really poor countries, really people that have very, very dollar-a-day incomes, they see it as the only way out, is electing somebody that represents them. But even if they raise the minimum wage, by 10%, like that's heresy. And the elites in those countries are also a big problem. They have residence in the U.S. They're really more U.S. citizens in some ways than they are citizens Bolivia or Chile or, you know. So you have to look at all of that. Like, don't get disillusioned with democracy, because I don't know what better system we could have for big populations. I think indigenous peoples have other choices. They have other older forms of government, but we don't. I think we need real democracy, not this manufactured democracy that we're getting now. You know, and the U.S. is the main culprit in this, the very main culprit. Yeah, they just go hysterical when a country is threatening them with a real alternative. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Eileen. And final word, and in terms of a capitalist project, David is getting his books ready for you to pick one up. So.
It only took, is this working? It only took 100 years to get from your perceived benevolence of Henry Ford to what we have now. And I think what many of us who are highly skeptical of your assertions feel that there is something inherent about capitalism that goes from that point to what we have now, and there are no small fixes. I want to say something about something very local, and that's the civic election coming up in the fall. 50 years ago, the COPE, which is short for Coalition of Progressive Electors, was formed. It's the oldest political party in the city, and it was very, very progressive. Over the years, it's had its ups and downs, but it is back, and it is looking to work with people who are talking about real change in the city. And any of you who are interested in talking to me about that, I would be really pleased to talk with you. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Are you saying Lindsay Brown for mayor?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that practical note about taking the skills and awareness we're looking at from Noam Chomsky's writing and David's interviews from the global discontents to the local, hyper-local, and also to think about, in our own work, to think about continuing the peeling of our denial and our friends and our coworkers, to think about how we are as accomplices in this resistance from the Coast Salish people to the occupation here in Vancouver. So lots of work we can do carrying forward. And to the brothers' words about the heartfelt comments and the words, I want to thank all the panelists and David, the road warrior that you are, for being here, and our panelists for sharing very strong, insightful experiences. And to you for spending a beautiful Saturday, sunny Saturday, a rare winter day with us inside. Thank you so much for being here. We will post the video from today on DG Solidarity on YouTube, and we'll post a link on the Facebook page if you're on that. Also on Tuesday's Democracy North show, which I host every Tuesday, we'll broadcast some highlights on this Tuesday at 5 p.m. It's also podcast at w2media.org. And then on Saturday's Red Eye in coming weeks, we'll also hear this. So lots of larger audiences will hear this conversation today. Without any further ado, come down and talk with David, and I think he's pen out to sign your book.